Kansas, April 1874, the tornado came without warning, a black funnel twisting out of the prairie sky and tearing through the wheat fields like a beast unchained. By the time it passed, the sun was low and the world looked like it had been clawed apart. The roof of the farmhouse was gone. The barn was a pile of timbers. And still, Penelope Zeller stood barefoot in the broken dirt, her hair tangled with grass, her arms wrapped tight around her two children, both crying into her skirts. Her hands shook, but she did not fall. Her neighbors were miles off in every direction, and the closest town, Widow's Bluff, was half a day's ride. She had no horse anymore. The old mare had bolted when the wind screamed. The only thing still standing on her land was the stone chimney and the battered chicken coop, half crushed, one hen wandering dazed in circles. Penelope pressed a kiss to her son's forehead. "It's over, Alec. We're all right." Alec was 6 and trying not to cry. His sister, Abigail, only 3, clung to Penelope's waist like she thought the wind might return and steal her away. Penelope didn't know where to start. Her life had been split in two before the storm and after. The next day brought silence and ash-gray skies. She dug through the debris, salvaging what she could. A dented kettle, a cracked photograph of her late husband, a set of plates wrapped in a ragged towel. She built a fire in the open, boiled water and sat with her children under a tarp she strung between 2 leaning fence posts. By the second night, her hands were blistered and her body ached. She sat staring at the fire when a figure stepped through the field, his boots crunching over broken fence rails. He was tall, dust-covered, and carried a pack slung over one shoulder. A rifle was strapped to his back. His clothes were worn but clean, and his eyes were sharp, scanning the wreckage with a kind of quiet understanding. "I saw smoke," he said. "Figured someone might need help." Penelope stood slowly, shielding her children with one arm. "We don't have anything worth stealing." He raised both hands. "Not here to steal, just passing through. Name's Kieran Nash." Penelope studied him. He looked like a man who had lived on the road a long time. There was weariness in the set of his shoulders, but steadiness too. "I'm Penelope." "This is Alec and Abigail." Her voice cracked on their names, but she held her chin high. Kieran looked down at the children, gave a small nod. "You got hit bad. We lost everything." He looked around the ruins. "Not everything." His gaze returned to her. "You're still standing." Penelope didn't respond. She was too tired. Kieran shifted his pack off his shoulder. "I can help rebuild if you want. I do decent work. Used to help my uncle build cabins in Wyoming territory. I don't ask for much, just a place to sleep and maybe a plate if there's food." Penelope hesitated. She had no reason to trust him, but something about the way he stood solid, calm, made her believe him. "We have beans," she said. "And the tarp, that's it. I've slept worse. And I can work while you rest." Penelope nodded slowly. "All right, but just for a few days." "Fair enough," he said. The next day he cleared the wreckage of the barn first, stacking the salvageable wood and separating broken nails from whole ones. His hands were rough and fast, his movements sure. Alec followed him around like a shadow, asking questions about every tool. Kieran answered each one with patience. Penelope watched from the tarp's edge, her arms wrapped around Abigail. She had not seen a man work like that since her husband died 3 years ago. By the third day, Kieran had framed a new shelter. It was small, just 4 walls and a roof of stitched canvas, but it stood. That night, they all sat inside around a fire in a cracked stove he'd found upright in the rubble. Kieran took his stew quietly, eyes flicking to the children as they leaned against their mother. Penelope saw the way he softened when Alec offered him the last piece of bread. "You sure?" Kieran asked. Alec nodded. "You built our house." "You should have it." Kieran smiled, and something in Penelope's chest pulled tight. Later, after the children were asleep, she stepped outside and found him sitting on a stump, sharpening a blade. "Why are you really here?" she asked. He looked up. "Guess I was looking for something I lost a long time ago. Thought maybe I'd find it out here." "And did you?" He glanced toward the house. "Not yet, but I might." They sat in silence. The stars were sharp overhead, the air still tinged with smoke and damp dirt. "I buried my husband under that tree," Penelope said, pointing to the cottonwood near the field. 3 years ago. He was kind, quiet, like you." Kieran nodded, not pushing her to say more. "I thought I was doing all right, until the storm." You did all right, he said. You kept them safe. Penelope looked at him, really looked. His face was rough, jaw dark with stubble, but his eyes were clear. You could stay, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I will if you want me to. She nodded once. The next morning he was already up, splitting wood. Alec handed him nails. Abigail followed Penelope as she cooked over the fire. The wind was gentle now, and the sun warmed the earth. By the end of the week, they had walls up on a new house. Not perfect, but strong. That night, as they sat by the fire, Kieran reached for her hand. She let him take it. I ain't had a place to belong in a long time, he said. Penelope leaned her head against his shoulder. You belong here. Clay dust clung to Penelope's hem as she knelt near the new root cellar, hands deep in the cool soil where she'd planted beans just that morning. The sky had been holding steady for days now, pale blue with high, dry clouds that didn't threaten. Kieran's hammer struck wood in the background, steady as a heartbeat, driving shingles down with a rhythm that no longer startled her. The sound had become a kind of comfort, one she didn't realize she'd come to rely on. Inside the house, Alec was tracing letters in ash on the hearthstone, tongue between his teeth. Abigail hummed to herself as she stacked pebbles into a crooked tower beside him. Penelope had taught both children not to wander far. With the land still littered with splinters and rusted nails, she couldn't afford a careless injury. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood, brushing dirt from her palms as Kieran walked toward her, sleeves rolled and shirt damp from the heat. He carried a length of timber balanced across one shoulder. That corner's coming loose, he said, nodding toward the shed they'd patched 2 days prior. Might need another brace. She squinted at the lean-to. Think it'll hold till morning? Could. But I'd rather not leave it guessing. She stepped aside to let him pass, and as he did, the scent of juniper and sawdust lingered in the air between them. Later, as dusk fell, and the children nodded off beneath the quilt she'd pieced together from what scraps the storm hadn't taken, Penelope stepped outside with a tin cup of chicory and found Kieran seated on the porch rail, one boot turned sideways against the post. I boiled too much, she said, handing him the cup. He accepted it without a word, taking a slow sip before glancing toward the field. You've got hawks nesting out there, he said. Saw one take a rabbit this afternoon, just past the ridge. She followed his gaze, though the field was only shadow now. They've been nesting in that tree since I was a girl. My father used to say they watched over the land better than any fence. He nodded, the corner of his mouth twitching. I believe it. She folded her arms across her chest to hold in the warmth of the cup she no longer held. You said you came from Wyoming once. Spent a few years there. My uncle had a spread near Lander, mostly cattle, but he dabbled in sheep. Didn't end well. What happened? Cattlemen didn't take to it. Fence lines got cut. 2 lambs went missing. My uncle wouldn't sell, but he got sick before spring. When he passed, I didn't see a reason to stay. She leaned against the post beside him, fingers tracing the worn grain. You ever think of settling again? Not as a hired hand, I mean. He looked down at the cup in his hand, then up at her. I do now. They stood like that for a while, quiet between them, not strained but full of all the things not yet said. The moon was rising, thin and silver, casting a soft light over the field. Do you miss him? He asked, voice low. She didn't pretend not to know who he meant. Most days, yes, but it's different now. I remember him with peace more than pain. That's a mercy, she nodded. I lost someone once, he said, eyes fixed on the horizon. She was a doctor's daughter. Name was Lydia. We were young. She died of fever before we could make it official. Penelope turned to him slowly. You never mentioned her. Didn't seem right before, but I think she'd have liked this place. And I think she'd have liked you. Penelope stepped closer, her voice barely above the night breeze. You've built more than just walls here, Kieran, I know. She reached for his hand, not hesitantly but with surety, fingers threading through his. He held fast, his grip rough and warm. Inside, a floorboard creaked as Alex shifted in his sleep. The wind stirred the wheat shoots barely tall enough to ripple. Somewhere out in the dark, the hawk called once, sharp and high. Kieran looked at her. I could stay for good, if you'd want that. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she rested her head against his shoulder, and the way he leaned into her said everything the night needed. The first rain since the storm came soft and steady, soaking into the thirsty earth without thunder or wind. Penelope stood barefoot on the new porch, a shawl around her shoulders, watching the drops gather on the lip of the barrel Kieran had set beneath the eaves. The house behind her breathed warm with stew and the sound of Abigail's light snoring. Alec had fallen asleep on a flour sack stuffed with feathers, his legs curled like a cat's near the hearth. Kieran came up the steps with a bundle of kindling tucked under one arm. His boots left wet prints on the boards, but she didn't mind. He set the wood down near the door and paused, brushing rain from his brow with the back of his hand. "She's holding," he said, nodding toward the roof. "No leaks." Penelope tilted her head toward the corner over the pantry. One drip just above the shelves. "Nothing worth worrying over." He stepped to her side, close but not crowding. "I'll fix it tomorrow." "Always tomorrow with you," she said, her voice teasing, but there was warmth in it. "Gives me reason to stay," he said. They didn't look at each other, not at first. The wind tugged at the edge of her shawl, and she let it. The quiet between them had grown easier, like something planted long ago was finally pushing up through the soil. She drew in a breath. "Abigail's been asking if you'll take her to the creek. She's convinced frogs come out when it rains." "We'll go," he said. Next dry morning, Penelope turned then, eyes searching his. "You don't feel like passing through any more?" "I don't." She waited, letting the rain speak in the silence that followed. "I signed my name at the post office last week," he said. "On the land registry. It's not much, just a claim marker, but I put it beside yours." Her chest rose. "You didn't tell me. I wanted to be sure before I said it out loud." "And are you?" He looked at her full then, his voice quiet but certain. "I've never been more sure of anything." She didn't reply. Instead, she reached for his wrist, fingers resting just above the place his pulse beat steady beneath the skin. They stood like that, side by side, rain falling soft around them. The next day, Kieran lifted Alec onto the mule he'd traded for out of town. The boy grinned, gripping the reins like he'd been born to them. Abigail ran after, her shoes muddy, her braid bouncing with every step. Penelope leaned against the porch beam, arms crossed, watching them head down the fence line toward the creek. That afternoon, she picked wild greens near the tree line and returned to find Kieran repairing the pantry roof with Alec handing him nails. Abigail sat on the grass, humming to herself as she sewed 2 buttons onto a square of cloth. The patchwork quilt she and Penelope had started was growing, slow but steady. Inside, the air held the scent of bread baking. Penelope stoked the coals and dipped her hands into the basin to wash the greens. The windows were open, letting in the scent of damp leaves and pine. Her fingers moved without thought, practiced and sure. The ache in her shoulders from lifting timbers had faded days ago, replaced by something deeper. Not pain, not quite peace, something between. That night, after the children were asleep, she pulled a chair to the open door and sat with her sewing in her lap. Kieran joined her, his hands calloused and stained, his shirt damp at the collar from washing up. He didn't speak, but he watched her. Not in the way men sometimes did, but with quiet interest, like he was memorizing the way her needle moved through cloth. She didn't look up. "You're staring." "I know." She gave a small smile, but kept sewing. A hush stretched between them, deep and patient. He ran a hand along the grain of the doorframe. "I never built anything that stood long, never stayed anywhere long enough to see the seasons change. You'll see them here," she said. "The wheat turns gold in July. Crickets crowd the porch in August. September smells like apple skins and wood smoke. I want to see all of it." Penelope set her sewing aside and met his gaze. "Then stay." He reached for her hand, rough fingers brushing the back of hers. "I already have." She leaned into him then, her shoulder against his arm, and they sat until the moon climbed high, the only sound the soft rustle of wind through the wheat that had begun, against all odds, to grow again. April deepened into May with the land greening in slow, deliberate strokes, like a painter testing spring's palette. New shoots climbed through the furrows where Penelope had worked the soil with her own hands. The wheat stretched higher each morning, and the prairie grasses beyond swayed with the steady warmth of lengthening days. The storm's scars remained twisted fencing, a splintered wagon axle half buried in the pasture, but the rhythm of life had returned. Kieran had begun drafting a map of the homestead on scrap paper. He kept folded in the inside pocket of his coat outlines of the field rows, the barn's future footprint, a chicken run he'd started shaping from salvaged timber. He didn't show it to Penelope at first, just worked on it in the evenings while the children slept, pencil gripped firm in his hand. One night, she found him tracing a line near the stream bed. "You planning to build a town?" she asked, leaning over his shoulder. His voice was quiet. "Just thinking through the years ahead." She touched the edge of the page. "You've drawn the cottonwood. Didn't feel right to leave it out." She didn't reply, but he felt her weight settle beside him on the bench. Her fingers brushed his sleeve once, then stayed there. The next morning, Kieran rode into Widow's Bluff before dawn, trading a parcel of rabbit pelts and a hand-carved yoke for nails, a saw blade, and 2 bolts of muslin. He returned by evening, the mule slower under the weight but steady. Penelope met him at the gate, arms crossed, one eyebrow raised. "That muslin wasn't on the list I gave you." He dismounted and untied the bundle. "Wasn't, figured you might want it anyway." "For what?" "Curtains, maybe a dress." She held his gaze a long moment. "You think I need more dresses? I think you deserve one that wasn't stitched from flour sacks." She took the fabric without answering, but that night, she stayed up late by lamplight, cutting careful lines into the soft weave. The children grew quieter as summer crept closer. Days spent helping plant squash along the fence line or collecting stones for the chimney base. Alec had taken to following Kieran with a notebook of his own, sketching out tools and labeling them in uneven letters. Abigail, more cautious, watched from her mother's side but had begun humming lullabies she claimed were her own invention. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the ridge, Penelope stood beside the well with a bucket in hand. Kieran approached, wiping his palms on his trousers. "You're quiet tonight," he said. "There's a letter from my sister in Topeka. She says the mill's opening again. Wants me to bring the children and stay through summer. You thinking of going?" "I'm thinking of how I used to imagine a life that wasn't tied to weather or fences." He nodded once, the silence between them turning cautious. She looked up. "But I don't want to run from what we've made here." He took a step closer, the evening air thick with the scent of tilled earth and pine. "I hoped you'd say that." "Why?" "Because I've been saving something." He reached into his coat and drew out a small box. The wood was plain, the hinges rusted at the corners, but inside sat a ring of carved walnuts, smooth and dark, set with a single piece of polished river stone. "It's not gold," he said, voice low, "but I shaped it myself. Took 3 tries to get the fit right." She didn't speak. Her thumb brushed the edge of the ring, then she slipped it on her finger. "It's warm," she said. "It's been in my pocket since last frost." She looked at him, her eyes steady. "Then I'd say it's waited long enough." He didn't kiss her, not yet, but his hand cupped the back of hers like a promise. The wind picked up in the trees beyond the property, and the sky turned a rich violet. That night, as they sat beneath the stars, Penelope rested her head against his chest. He pressed his lips to her hair, and she let her eyes close, the sound of his heart anchoring her. "I thought I'd never feel safe again," she whispered. "You don't have to think anymore," he said. "You just have to be," and for the first time since the storm, she allowed herself to believe it. By late June, the wheat brushed Penelope's waist when she walked the rows at dusk, the heads full and gold-tinged, heavy with promise. The house, now fitted with a porch swing Kieran crafted from barrel staves, stood steady and square beneath the open sky. The scent of sawed cedar still clung to the beams where he'd hung Abigail's wind chime, a rusted spoon, and a few glass beads she'd found near the old road. On a morning washed pale with fog, Penelope set a loaf to rise on the hearth and tied her hair back with the ribbon Kieran had brought from the trading post. She found him near the north fence, squatting beside a snapped post, one knee pressed into the earth. "You're up early," she said. "I wanted to get this mended before the sun came through." He glanced up, then pointed to a set of small hoofprints in the softened dirt. "A deer came through last night, young one. I think it's been bedding near the creek." She crouched beside him, tracing the shape of the print. "They never used to come this close. They will now. Land remembers kindness." She looked at him, not surprised anymore by the way he said things that made her feel steadier just by hearing them. "Do you want to walk with me to the bluff?" she asked. "I haven't been in months. I'd like that." They left Alec and Abigail with Mrs. Hartley, the widow who lived a mile east and had taken to watching the children like they were her own kin. The walk to the bluff was long and slow, following a path worn by years of wagon wheels and bare feet. Wild prairie roses bloomed in thickets along the edge, their petals pale and thin as moth wings. When they reached the rise, Penelope stopped at the edge of the drop, her breath catching. The land stretched out below in folded green and gold, dotted with shadows from passing clouds. The creek caught the light in one place, a silver ribbon curling through the hills. "I used to come here with my mother," she said. She said it was the closest place to heaven she'd ever seen. Kieran stood behind her, hands resting lightly on her waist. She had the right of it. She turned to him. "I want to marry you here." He didn't answer right away, just reached for her hand and held it against his chest. "Then we will," he said. With the sky to witness it. They were wed 3 weeks later, barefoot on the bluff with Alec holding Abigail's hand and Mrs. Hartley standing near the cottonwood, eyes glistening. The wind lifted Penelope's braid and carried Kieran's vow out over the valley like a hymn. There was no preacher, only the land and the words they chose for each other, plain, honest, and spoken without hesitation. Afterward, Penelope led Kieran down to the stream where she unpinned the brooch her mother had worn to her own wedding. She set it on a flat rock by the water where it caught the sun like fire. "For the ones who can't be here," she said. Kieran bowed his head. "May they know we remember." That night, they danced in the yard to the sound of Alec playing a tune he'd taught himself on a reed whistle. Abigail twirled in her bare feet until she fell down giggling in the grass. Penelope's dress, sewn from the muslin he'd bought, was marked with dust and dew, but she wore it like silk. As stars climbed overhead, Kieran pulled her close. "You've changed me," he said. She rested her head against his collarbone. "No, you just stopped running long enough to remember who you were." They built their days slowly after that. Kieran finished the barn by August, and Penelope took in sewing for the schoolteacher in town. Alex started reading aloud at night, his voice steadying with each chapter. Abigail learned the names of every bird that nested near the fence line. By winter, the house was filled with warmth and the scent of dried herbs strung from the rafters. Kieran carved toys for the children in the evenings, and Penelope began writing letters to her sister again. The pages filled not with sorrow but with stories of growing things and steady hands. In spring, they planted more than before. 2 new rows of corn, an apple sapling near the well. A patch of wildflowers Abigail insisted would make the bees feel welcome. One night, long after the children had fallen asleep, Penelope and Kieran sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a quilt, the air full of crickets and the scent of turned soil. "I never knew stillness could feel like this," he said. She leaned against him, her voice barely above the hush of the wind. "It's not stillness. It's peace." He kissed the top of her head, and they watched the stars in silence, the swing rocking gently beneath them, the rhythm of their life no longer something they chased, but something they lived together.